The number 40 was written in chalk before anyone knew it would matter. It sat in the upper corner of a black slate board inside the medical intake tent at Camp Briarwood, just outside Columbus, Georgia, August 1945, the air thick as wet cotton and heavy with the smell of antiseptic and canvas warmed by the sun. Dr. Thomas Reed stood beneath that number with a clipboard in his hand and a pencil worn flat at the edge, moving down a line of names that were not names to him yet, only serials and ages and weights recorded in pounds, each woman stepping forward when called, each one silent, composed, and thinner than any civilian chart he had memorized in medical school back in Ohio. He had treated soldiers in France, farm boys from Iowa and machinists from Detroit, and he had learned to keep his hands steady and his thoughts separate from the work, because distance made efficiency possible, and efficiency kept people alive. The prisoners were processed the same way every week, examined under the same yellow bulbs, measured against the same standards, cleared or flagged, moved along like freight cars on a schedule. Outside the tent, a guard's boots shifted against gravel. Somewhere farther off a truck engine coughed and went still. Inside, the only sound was the scratch of Reed's pencil and the soft instructions of the interpreter standing at his shoulder. German women prisoners of war filed in wearing gray camp dresses that hung loosely on their frames, fabric moving against bone with a sound like paper. Reed did not look at faces longer than necessary. He read pulses, checked reflexes, listened to lungs through a stethoscope that had grown warm from the day. Next, he said without lifting his eyes. The interpreter translated. The line moved. They were lighter than expected, most under 100 pounds, some closer to 90, one at 86. Numbers that should have alarmed him but did not, because shortages in transport and long months of uncertainty explained many things. He told himself this was temporary depletion, not catastrophe. He told himself it was not his place to rewrite the circumstances of war. Then Ingrid Keller stepped forward. She did not rush. She did not hesitate. She placed her hands flat on the examination table as if it were a desk in a classroom, and she had come prepared to answer questions. 28 years old. Former communications clerk, according to the file. 5 feet 5 inches. Reed noted her weight, 92 pounds. He wrote it down, the pencil pressing harder than before. Any dizziness? He asked. Eyes still on the chart. The interpreter relayed the question. Ingrid answered in English, careful and deliberate. Sometimes at night. Her voice was steady, neither pleading nor defensive. Reed glanced up then, just for a second, long enough to register that her gaze did not drop. He checked her pupils. Normal reaction. He listened to her chest. Clear breath sounds, but shallow. He moved to the next step, routine and precise. Yet as she stepped aside and the next woman replaced her, something unsettled him, not dramatic, not obvious, just a faint irregularity in the rhythm of the morning. The second woman showed similar pallor, the same faint tremor in her fingers when she extended her hand for a pulse check. The third reported night dizziness too. Reed paused. He adjusted his glasses. He flipped back a page on the clipboard and compared the weights and temperatures he had recorded in the last 10 minutes. A pattern began to form, quiet and unwelcome. Next, he called again, but his tone had changed, softer, less automatic. The line continued. One by one, similar details surfaced, mild swelling at the ankles, unexplained fatigue, a persistent dry cough that did not align with infection. No dramatic symptoms. No emergency that would justify sirens or shouting. Just small deviations stacking together like thin sheets of paper until the pile could no longer be ignored. Reed removed his stethoscope and let it hang around his neck. The tent felt warmer. He asked the interpreter to repeat a question to the entire group waiting outside about their water source and their daily rations. The answer came back consistent. Same supply, same meals, same schedule. Ingrid, still standing near the side wall, spoke again without being prompted. We thought it was the heat, she said. But it is worse after lights out. Reed looked at her fully this time. Worse how? She hesitated only a fraction. Heart beats too fast. Hard to breathe when lying down. The tent seemed to narrow around the sound of those words. Reed turned back to the charts. Rapid heart rate recorded in 3 entries. Elevated respiration in 2 more. He felt a slow pressure building. Behind his eyes, the kind that comes not from exhaustion but from recognition. This was not simple malnutrition. This was systemic. He called for the scale to be recalibrated and rechecked 2 of the earlier women. The numbers held. He asked for blood pressure readings to be repeated manually. Lower than expected. He stepped back from the table and pressed his fingers against the bridge of his nose. 40 names on the intake list for the week. 40 women in the compound. If this pattern extended beyond the ones he had seen in the last hour, it was not a minor oversight. It was a ticking clock. He thought about procedure, about forms that required signatures before changes could be made to rations or supplies. He thought about how easily such symptoms could be dismissed as stress. He thought about the chalkboard outside with the number 40 written casually at the top. Ingrid remained where she was, watching not with fear but with attention, as if she understood that something had shifted in the room. Reed exhaled slowly and felt the air catch halfway down his throat. For the first time that morning, he was no longer processing prisoners. He was standing at the edge of a discovery that could not wait for paperwork. He picked up his pencil again, but this time he did not write another weight. He drew a firm line beneath the last entry and circled the number at the top of the page. 40. The chalk number outside was no longer a tally. It was a responsibility. Dr. Thomas Reed did not erase the number on the board that afternoon. Instead, he walked out of the intake tent and looked at it from a distance, as if space might clarify what proximity could not. The sun had shifted west, casting long shadows from the barbed wire fence that bordered the compound, and the late summer air pressed against his collar as though it wanted to keep him still. 40 women. 40 heartbeats that had begun to sound the same beneath his stethoscope. He stepped back inside and asked the interpreter to gather the women he had already examined into a separate section of the tent. No urgency in his voice, no alarm, only a calm directive that carried more weight than volume ever could. Ingrid Keller was among them, standing near the center, her posture straight despite the fatigue Reed now recognized as more than simple exhaustion. He set his clipboard on the table and began again, this time slower. He rechecked pulses with his fingers instead of relying solely on numbers, feeling for rhythm and strength. He counted under his breath, 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, letting each beat register. Several were faster than they should have been at rest. He asked about diet again, this time more precisely. How much milk? How often fresh vegetables? Any changes in the past 2 weeks? The answers revealed a narrow pattern. Canned goods, powdered milk diluted thin, bread that arrived in regular shipments, but little else. He requested a sample of the water supply from the compound pump and instructed an orderly to bring it immediately. Regulations required a formal request for such analysis, but Reed had learned during the war that delay could masquerade as discipline. While he waited, he asked Ingrid to describe the evenings in detail. She spoke carefully, choosing each word as if it were fragile. The dizziness came after lying down. The pounding in the chest lasted several minutes. Some women woke feeling breathless, but improved by morning. Reed closed his eyes briefly and ran through possibilities. Infection would bring fever. Dehydration alone would not account for swelling. A deficiency perhaps, something slow and cumulative, something that crept rather than struck. He opened his eyes and began examining ankles and wrists more closely, pressing gently to test for fluid retention. The impressions lingered longer than they should have. He asked one of the women to walk across the tent and back again. Her steps were steady but slower than expected for her age. He felt the shift within himself then, a movement away from detached observation toward responsibility. He removed his glasses and cleaned them with the edge of his sleeve, buying a moment to think. Outside, a guard laughed at something someone had said, the sound ordinary and out of place against the gravity settling inside the tent. The orderly returned with a jar of water drawn from the pump. Reed held it up to the light. Clear, no visible sediment, nothing obvious. He set it aside and made a decision. He instructed that no more examinations proceed until he reviewed the previous week's records for comparison. He walked to the small records office near the edge of the compound and requested access to the prior intake charts. The clerk looked surprised but complied. Reed flipped through the pages rapidly at first, then more slowly, tracing patterns with his finger. Similar weights. Similar minor complaints. The notes had been brief, perhaps too brief. He felt heat rise in his face, not from the Georgia sun, but from the realization that the signs had been present and unassembled. He returned to the tent carrying the older charts and spread them across the table. Ingrid watched the papers move beneath his hands. "Is it serious?" she asked softly. Reed hesitated. "It could become serious," he replied, choosing accuracy over reassurance. He calculated roughly in his head. If all 40 women shared the same underlying issue and it progressed unchecked, the consequences would not announce themselves dramatically. They would appear as sudden collapses during routine work or sleep, dismissed as weakness until too many had fallen ill to ignore. He felt a tightening in his chest that mirrored the symptoms he had recorded. For a moment, he allowed himself to sit down heavily on the folding chair behind him. The canvas creaked under his weight. He looked at his hands, at the faint tremor that had begun there. He had prided himself on composure, on maintaining distance from outcomes he could not control. Yet here was a situation within reach, within his authority, and he had almost let it pass as routine. The awareness struck deeper than fatigue. He stood again and straightened his coat. He sent word to the camp commander requesting an immediate meeting regarding medical provisions. While waiting, he began drafting a list in deliberate script: dietary adjustment, increased access to fresh produce, fortified milk rations, electrolyte supplementation, monitoring of heart rate twice daily. Each item felt like a small lever that might redirect the trajectory he had glimpsed. The commander arrived 20 minutes later, hat tucked under his arm, expression neutral. Reed presented his findings without embellishment, pointing to the recurring data points, explaining the risk of systemic decline if unaddressed. The commander listened, then glanced toward the compound beyond the tent flap. "Is it urgent?" he asked. Reed met his gaze evenly. "Yes," he said. There was no dramatic appeal in his tone, only certainty. The commander studied the charts for a long moment and then nodded once. "Do what you need to do." The permission was simple, but it shifted the entire landscape of the afternoon. Reed returned to the women and explained through the interpreter that adjustments would begin immediately. There would be changes to meals, additional checks at night, and a temporary suspension of labor duties until strength improved. No cheers followed the announcement. No visible relief. Only a collective exhale that seemed to lighten the air by degrees. Ingrid remained still, absorbing the information with the same composed attention she had shown since morning. Reed realized then that her earlier question had not been driven by fear, but by assessment. She had been measuring him as carefully as he had been measuring them. As the sun lowered further and the shadows stretched long across the dirt, Reed walked once more past the chalkboard. He did not erase the number 40. Instead, he drew a second line beneath it and wrote a single word beside it in smaller letters: monitored. The chalk dust clung to his fingers. He brushed it away and looked toward the compound where the women were returning quietly to their barracks. The problem had not been solved yet, but it had been named, and naming it had shifted the balance. In the fading light of that August evening, the camp looked unchanged from the outside. Fences and guard towers silhouetted against a pink horizon, but inside one tent a different kind of vigilance had taken root, steady and deliberate, determined that the next time a pattern emerged it would not wait quietly to be discovered. The next morning arrived without announcement, only a gradual thinning of darkness over Camp Briarwood and the faint metallic sound of a flag ring tapping against a pole in the distance. Dr. Thomas Reed had slept little. He had remained in the records office long after sunset, reviewing charts beneath a single desk lamp until the edges of the paper seemed to blur into one continuous line. By dawn he was back inside the medical tent, sleeves rolled precisely to the same height as the day before, a fresh stack of forms arranged in even alignment. The chalkboard outside still carried the number 40 and the word monitored beside it, the letters slightly smudged by humidity, but legible. Reed stepped into the compound with a clipboard and a small leather case containing additional instruments he had requested overnight from the supply depot in town. The changes had begun quietly in the kitchen before sunrise. Fresh milk had been delivered in metal cans beaded with condensation. Crates of leafy greens and oranges sat on a long wooden table where powdered rations had previously dominated. The camp cook, and used to such urgency for prisoners, followed instructions without commentary. Reed moved from barack to barack with deliberate pacing, stopping at each doorway to observe before entering. He watched how the women rose from their bunks, how long they remained seated before standing, how they held the edge of the bed as they shifted their weight. Subtle details mattered now. Ingrid Keller was already awake, sitting upright with her hands folded in her lap as though awaiting a classroom roll call. When she saw Reed, she did not smile, but she nodded once in acknowledgement, a gesture that carried more steadiness than gratitude ever could. Reed began the morning checks with blood pressure readings taken manually, his fingers pressing against fabric and skin with professional restraint. The numbers were still low, but no lower than the previous day. He listened again to heart rhythms, counting carefully, noting slight improvements in some and continued irregularity in others. He asked each woman whether the night had been easier. Several reported that the pounding in their chest had lessened after additional water had been provided before lights out. One admitted she had slept through the night for the first time in weeks. Reed recorded each comment in full sentences, no abbreviations, no shorthand that might later conceal significance. By mid-morning he had established a temporary schedule of monitoring every 6 hours, an unusual measure for a group not officially classified as critical. A junior medic raised an eyebrow at the intensity, but Reed responded only by handing him a list of tasks. There was no room for debate when patterns were at stake. Ingrid approached him after the second round of checks. "Doctor," she said, her English steady. "The others are calmer." Reed glanced at her chart before responding. "Calm helps the body," he replied. She considered this and then added quietly, "So does being seen." The words settled in the space between them with unexpected weight. Reed did not answer immediately. He understood that she was not referring solely to medical observation, but to acknowledgement. The distinction was subtle, yet profound. He moved outside the barack and leaned briefly against the wooden railing, allowing himself a measured breath. In the distance, the camp commander crossed the yard, pausing to exchange a few words with a guard. The atmosphere appeared unchanged to anyone passing through, yet beneath the surface a different current was moving, quiet and corrective. That afternoon, Reed received preliminary results from a rapid analysis conducted at the local clinic in town. The water supply tested within acceptable limits, ruling out contamination. The diet, however, showed insufficient levels of certain nutrients when evaluated against the prolonged conditions the women had endured prior to arrival. The deficiency was not dramatic in isolation, but cumulative over months. Reed studied the report in silence. It confirmed what his instincts had begun to assemble the previous day. This was a slow erosion rather than a sudden event, a weakening that required sustained correction rather than a single intervention. He returned to the compound and gathered the women once more in the shade near the mess hall. Through the interpreter, he explained that their bodies had been operating on reserves that were nearly depleted. With proper nutrition and rest, he expected recovery. There was no embellishment in his tone, no promise beyond what he could reasonably deliver. Ingrid listened closely, then translated portions into clearer German for those who struggled with the interpreter's phrasing. Her voice carried steady authority without challenge. Reed observed how the others looked to her, not as a leader appointed by rank, but as a reference point for composure. In that moment he recognized that the stability he sought medically was mirrored socially in her presence. Over the next 48 hours the changes began to manifest in measurable increments. Pulse rates slowed slightly. Swelling diminished in a few cases. Appetite improved. Reed charted each adjustment with careful notation, resisting the temptation to declare success prematurely. At night, he walked once more past the chalkboard and traced the word monitored with his thumb, as though reaffirming its necessity. He no longer saw the number 40 as a statistic. He saw it as 40 trajectories bending gradually away from decline. Late on the third evening, Ingrid approached him outside the tent while he was closing his case of instruments. The sky had turned a muted lavender above the fence line. "You almost did not see it," she said, not accusatory, merely factual. Reed considered the statement. "You are correct," he answered. She nodded, accepting the admission without judgment. "But you did." The exchange lasted only seconds, yet it altered something within him more decisively than the medical charts had. He realized that the moment he had paused, rechecked, and questioned routine was the true turning point. Not the discovery itself, but the refusal to dismiss small signals. As the camp lights flickered on and the compound settled into evening quiet, Reed stood alone for a moment longer, listening to the faint murmur of conversation drifting from the barracks. There was no celebration, No visible transformation dramatic enough to mark the day in headlines. Yet the steady correction underway would mean that in the weeks ahead 40 women would rise from their bunks without dizziness, walk across the yard without breathlessness, and sleep without the unsettling rhythm that had haunted their nights. Reed closed his case and looked once more at the board. The chalk had begun to fade at the edges, but the number remained clear. He did not add to it. He did not subtract from it. He simply left it there, a quiet reminder that vigilance begins in the smallest irregularity and that responsibility, once recognized, does not wait for permission to act. By the end of the first week, the camp no longer felt suspended over an unseen edge. The changes were subtle, almost invisible to anyone who did not study numbers for a living. Yet to Dr. Thomas Reed, they were as clear as the line of pine trees bordering the perimeter fence. Morning pulses had slowed by an average of 8 beats per minute. Swelling that once left shallow impressions along the ankles had begun to recede. The mess hall, once quiet with mechanical chewing, now carried the low hum of conversation as the women adjusted to fuller plates and steadier energy. Reed walked through the compound with a small notebook instead of the thick intake ledger, jotting down observations in full sentences. Improved color in cheeks. No report of nocturnal palpitations. Gait steady across 50 yards. He measured distance deliberately, pacing out the yard in long strides so that his assessments were anchored to something tangible. Georgia's late summer heat remained constant, hovering in the high 80s by mid-afternoon, yet the women no longer appeared overwhelmed by it. They moved with measured confidence, not hurried, not fragile. Ingrid Keller continued to serve as a quiet axis around which the others oriented themselves. She had resumed helping in the mess hall voluntarily, ensuring that the additional milk and produce were distributed evenly, that no one stepped back out of habit or uncertainty. Reed noticed that she ate last, not out of deference, but from a habit of oversight. One afternoon he paused near the doorway and watched as she encouraged a younger woman to finish an orange, peeling it carefully and placing each segment on a tin plate with the precision of a nurse preparing instruments. The gesture was simple, yet it carried the same steadiness that had first drawn his attention. Later that day, Reed reviewed the compiled data with the camp commander beneath the awning outside the administration building. The commander removed his hat and wiped his forehead with a handkerchief while listening. Reed spoke plainly, outlining the trajectory of improvement and the necessity of maintaining the adjusted rations for several more weeks. There was no request for commendation, no attempt to dramatize the outcome. The commander nodded slowly and said that supply shipments would continue, as recommended. The exchange lasted less than 5 minutes, yet it secured the stability Reed had been guarding since that first irregular pulse. As evening approached, Reed returned to the chalkboard. The number 40 had begun to fade at the edges, dust collecting along the frame. He considered erasing it now that the immediate threat had receded, but instead he traced the outline lightly with fresh chalk, not to emphasize danger, but to preserve memory. He added no new words. The board did not require them. The following morning he gathered the women in the yard under a stretch of shade cast by the barack roof. He explained through the interpreter that routine monitoring would gradually decrease as their strength returned, but that he expected them to report any renewed symptoms without hesitation. His tone was neither stern nor indulgent. It carried the calm authority of someone who had witnessed how easily oversight could occur. Ingrid translated the final sentence herself, adding a phrase in German that softened the formality without diminishing the message. Several women nodded in understanding. One raised her hand tentatively and asked whether labor assignments would resume. Reed answered that light duties might return the following week, but only with continued medical review. There was a brief silence, not of fear but of adjustment, as the women recalibrated their expectations. That afternoon, Reed conducted a final comprehensive check of each individual chart. He compared weight measurements taken on the first day with those recorded that morning. Gains of 2 to 4 pounds appeared across the board. Minor improvements perhaps, yet meaningful when multiplied by 40. He closed each file carefully and placed it in a separate folder marked with the current date. The act felt ceremonial, though he did not acknowledge it aloud. As the sun dipped lower and the air cooled slightly, Ingrid approached him one last time near the tent entrance. "You will not need to watch us so closely soon," she said, her expression composed. Reed looked at the compound where the women were walking back from the mess hall, their steps aligned, but no longer tentative. "I will always watch closely," he replied, not as surveillance, but as principle. She studied his face for a moment and then offered a faint nod. "That is good," she said. "Someone should." The simplicity of the statement lingered after she walked away. Reed remained standing in the fading light, aware that the episode would never be recorded beyond internal reports and supply requisitions. There would be no headline, no public acknowledgement of the quiet recalibration that had taken place within a fenced compound in Georgia. Yet the significance did not depend on recognition. It resided in the incremental shifts that had redirected 40 lives from gradual decline toward recovery. As darkness settled and the camp lights flickered on, Reed returned to the chalkboard one final time. He erased the word monitored slowly, leaving only the number 40 visible against the slate. Then, after a pause, he drew a single horizontal line beneath it and set the chalk down. The board no longer signaled vigilance in progress, but vigilance remembered. He brushed the chalk dust from his hands and closed the tent flap behind him. Inside, the instruments were arranged neatly in their case, the charts stacked in order, the air carrying only the faint scent of disinfectant and canvas. Outside, the women's voices drifted softly across the yard, steady and unhurried. Reed allowed himself a measured breath, neither triumphant nor relieved, simply grounded in the knowledge that attention, once sharpened, could alter the course of what might otherwise pass unnoticed. In the quiet of that Georgia evening, beneath a sky fading from amber to deep blue, the camp appeared unchanged to any distant observer. But within its boundaries a standard had shifted. 40 was no longer a number awaiting outcome. It was a reminder that the smallest irregularity, when taken seriously, could preserve what routine might overlook, and that the choice to look again, to listen again, to question again, could steady the fragile balance between neglect and care. The weeks that followed did not arrive with fanfare. They unfolded in measured increments, like the steady turning of pages in a ledger that no one else intended to read. September edged into October, and the Georgia heat eased from the high 80s into the mid-70s, a shift subtle enough that only those who worked outdoors noticed the difference in their breathing. At Camp Briarwood the routine resumed, but it no longer carried the same unexamined weight it once had. Dr. Thomas Reed continued his rounds with deliberate regularity, though the intervals between examinations gradually widened as strength returned across the compound. He no longer needed to count heartbeats with the same intensity, yet he still placed the stethoscope carefully against each chest, listening not only for irregular rhythm, but for the steadiness that signaled equilibrium restored. The women moved through their assignments with measured confidence. Light kitchen duties returned first, followed by laundry detail and clerical sorting tasks that required attention rather than exertion. Reed observed from a distance as Ingrid Keller coordinated distribution of supplies in the mess hall, her posture straight, her gestures economical. She had gained 5 pounds since that first intake day, the number written plainly in his chart, yet it was not the weight alone that marked change. Color had returned to her face. Her voice carried without strain. She no longer paused before standing from a bench. One afternoon Reed paused near the perimeter fence and watched the women cross the yard in pairs, sunlight catching the edges of their gray uniforms. The scene appeared ordinary to any visitor. No visible drama, no sign that a quiet correction had taken place beneath the surface. The chalkboard outside the tent still displayed the number 40, though the edges had faded to a pale haze. Reed had considered erasing it several times, yet each morning he found himself leaving it intact. It had become less a warning and more a record, a testament to attention applied at the right moment. "Hey." Junior medic approached him during one round and asked, in a tone respectful yet curious, why he had invested such focus in what appeared at first to be minor complaints. Reed did not answer immediately. He looked across the yard where Ingrid was instructing another woman on how to portion fresh greens evenly among the trays. "Because minor complaints accumulate," he said finally. "An accumulation changes outcomes." The medic nodded, absorbing the lesson without further question. That evening Reed reviewed the most recent charts under the soft glow of a desk lamp. Pulse rates within normal range. Blood pressure stabilized. No further reports of night dizziness. He ran his finger lightly down the column of names, each one no longer a serial, but an individual he could recognize on sight. The realization did not produce pride. It produced clarity. The responsibility he had felt that first afternoon had not diminished with improvement. It had deepened into principle. Ingrid requested a brief conversation the following morning. They stood beneath the awning near the administration building, the air cool enough that Reed could feel autumn's approach. "We will be transferred soon," she said calmly. Another camp farther north. Reed had anticipated such movement. Transfers were common as administrative needs shifted. He nodded once. "You are stable enough to travel," he replied, clinical yet sincere. She regarded him with the same steady composure she had shown since their first exchange. "The others will travel well," she said. "Because you noticed." Reed looked at the ground for a moment, at the fine red dust that coated the yard. "Because you spoke," he answered. The acknowledgement passed between them without sentimentality. It was an exchange of fact rather than emotion. In the days before the transfer, Reed completed final evaluations for each of the 40 women. He wrote detailed summaries, ensuring that the next camp's medical officer would receive full documentation of the deficiency that had nearly gone unchecked. He included recommendations for continued dietary support and monitoring, not as alarm, but as precaution. When the transport truck arrived on a clear morning in mid-October, the women assembled with small bundles of personal items, their formation orderly yet relaxed. Reed stood near the intake tent, observing as names were called. Ingrid stepped forward when hers was spoken. She paused briefly, not to linger but to align her belongings. Then she looked toward Reed. There was no dramatic farewell. She did not extend her hand, nor did he. Instead, she gave the same measured nod she had offered weeks earlier inside the tent. It carried gratitude without spectacle, acknowledgement without dependency. Reed returned the gesture. The truck doors closed gently. The engine started with a low rumble and carried them beyond the gate, northward along a narrow Georgia road lined with pine and fading summer grass. The yard grew quiet after their departure. Reed walked back to the tent and stood before the chalkboard one final time. The number 40 remained faintly visible, softened by weeks of humidity and dust. He lifted the eraser slowly and pressed it against the slate. The chalk dissolved in a pale cloud that drifted briefly in the sunlight. When he stepped back, the board was blank, not erased from memory, only cleared for what might come next. He placed the eraser down and arranged his instruments inside the leather case with habitual precision. Outside, the camp resumed its steady rhythm. Guards rotating shifts, trucks arriving with supplies, ordinary sounds filling the air. Yet Reed understood that the lesson would remain long after the board had been cleared. Attention was not a temporary measure. It was a discipline. In the quiet of that October afternoon, he walked the perimeter once more, listening to the wind move lightly through the pine trees beyond the fence. There would be other intakes, other charts, other minor irregularities that tempted dismissal. He would not ignore them. The story of those 40 women would never appear in headlines or reports beyond official files, but its imprint had settled into his practice permanently. As the sun lowered and cast long shadows across the compound, Reed paused near the tent entrance and looked back at the blank slate. It no longer needed a number to carry meaning. The standard had shifted inward. The next time a faint irregularity surfaced in the quiet space between routine and responsibility, he would recognize it immediately, not because of fear, but because he had learned that vigilance, once chosen, becomes part of the hand that listens, the eye that reads, and the voice that decides to look again. Autumn settled fully over central Georgia by late October, replacing the heavy stillness of summer with a thinner, cooler air that carried the scent of pine and dry earth across the camp yard. Camp Briarwood continued its measured routine, yet for Dr. Thomas Reed the silence left by the departure of the 40 women felt distinct, like a room that had been quietly rearranged. The intake tent stood as it always had, canvas taut against a pale sky, examination table centered beneath the hanging bulb, leather case aligned with practiced precision along the side shelf. New names appeared on the roster in the days that followed, other prisoners arriving from distant transfers, each stepping forward when called, each carrying a history that would not be written in any visible column. Reed approached them with the same steady posture he had cultivated, yet something within his method had altered. He listened longer. He asked one more question than required. He paused before closing each file. The change was subtle, invisible to those who measured efficiency by speed alone. One afternoon, a shipment of medical supplies arrived in wooden crates, marked with black stenciled lettering and secured with metal clasps that clicked sharply when opened. Reed unpacked them carefully, inventorying vials of supplements, bandages, and instruments. He placed the newly delivered fortified milk tablets on the shelf nearest his desk, remembering how such small adjustments had redirected the course of 40 lives. The chalkboard outside the tent remained blank, a clean slate reflecting the afternoon light. He had resisted the urge to rewrite the number that had once occupied it. The lesson did not require repetition in chalk. It required application in practice. The junior medic who had once questioned his focus now mirrored his thoroughness, double-checking pulse counts and recording observations in full sentences rather than brief codes. Reed noticed this shift without comment. Influence, he had learned, did not always announce itself. It often moved quietly from one set of hands to another. As November approached, a letter arrived at the administration building bearing a military postmark from North Carolina. The envelope was thin, the paper inside folded precisely. Reed recognized the handwriting before he fully unfolded the page. Ingrid Keller had written in careful English, the letters measured and evenly spaced. She reported that the transfer had been smooth, that the medical officer at the new camp had received Reed's documentation and continued the recommended diet. She mentioned that the women remained stable, that none had experienced the symptoms that once disrupted their nights. At the bottom of the page she added a single sentence. We walk without counting our steps now. Reed read the line twice before placing the letter carefully inside his desk drawer. There was no flourish in her words, no excessive gratitude, only confirmation that vigilance had extended beyond a single compound. He returned to his rounds that afternoon with renewed clarity. The camp yard appeared unchanged to any observer, but Reed moved through it with a deeper awareness of the thin boundary between routine and oversight. He paused longer at the doorway of each barack, observing posture, listening to tone of voice, noting whether fatigue lingered at the edges of expression. He measured temperature not only with a thermometer, but with attention. Weeks passed. The pine trees beyond the fence shed dry needles that gathered along the ground in soft drifts. Morning frost appeared briefly on the grass in early December, melting as the sun rose. Reed stood outside the tent one such morning, breath visible in the cool air, and considered how easily that first pattern might have dissolved unnoticed into winter had he not paused. The realization did not weigh heavily, it steadied him. The camp commander stopped by later that day to inform him that budget reviews were underway and that some medical supplies might be reduced in the coming months. Reed listened, then responded calmly that prevention cost less than correction. The commander regarded him for a moment and then agreed to maintain the current allotment. It was a small administrative decision, yet it carried the same quiet significance as the adjustments made weeks earlier. Late in December, as the year approached its end, Reed removed the letter from his drawer once more. He unfolded it and traced the final sentence with his finger. He did not display it publicly or reference it in reports. Its purpose was not decoration. It was reminder. The next intake group arrived on a gray afternoon just before the holidays. Reed greeted them without haste. As he listened to their heartbeats and recorded their weights, he sensed no immediate irregularity, yet he remained attentive to nuance. When one prisoner mentioned mild dizziness after prolonged standing, Reed did not dismiss it. He adjusted her evaluation schedule and requested a review of her diet that same day. The correction was small, preventative rather than reactive. He did not wait for a pattern to confirm what instinct had already suggested. That evening he stepped outside the tent and looked across the yard where camp lights cast warm circles against the winter dusk. The board beside the entrance remained empty. He lifted a piece of chalk briefly, then lowered it again. The lesson no longer required inscription. It lived in the rhythm of his rounds, in the steadiness of his listening, in the extra question asked before a file was closed. Somewhere beyond the Georgia border, 40 women continued their days without counting the distance from bunk to doorway, without measuring each breath before sleep. Reed did not imagine gratitude as a debt or triumph as a reward. He understood the episode as recalibration, a moment when professional distance had nearly eclipsed responsibility and then been corrected by attention. As the final light faded from the sky, he returned inside the tent and closed the flap against the chill. Instruments aligned. Charts stacked. Lamp dimmed. Outside, the wind moved softly through the pine trees beyond the fence, a steady sound without urgency. Reed removed his coat and placed it carefully on the back of the chair. Tomorrow would bring another list of names, another line of measured pulses. He would listen. He would pause when necessary. He would look again when something felt slightly out of rhythm. The standard had shifted quietly and permanently, not written in chalk, but carried in practice, a discipline that would not fade with weather or transfer. And in the measured silence of that winter evening, vigilance no longer felt like burden. It felt like clarity. Winter settled deeper across Georgia as January gave way to February, and the mornings at Camp Briarwood carried a sharpness that lingered in the lungs before fading beneath pale sunlight. Dr. Thomas Reed arrived each day before the first roll call, unlocking the intake tent while frost still clung to the edges of the wooden steps. His routine remained steady, yet it no longer felt mechanical. The pause before each examination had become instinctive, a quiet space in which he allowed observation to precede assumption. New prisoners had rotated through the compound over the past months, their faces unfamiliar at first, then gradually distinct as charts filled with measured lines and careful notation. Reed continued to write in full sentences, resisting abbreviations even when time pressed. The junior medic had adopted the same habit, and together they maintained a rhythm that balanced efficiency with attention. The chalkboard outside the tent remained blank, its dark surface reflecting winter light like still water. Reed occasionally glanced at it when stepping outside, not in nostalgia but in recognition that its emptiness represented vigilance carried internally rather than displayed. One afternoon, a supply convoy arrived bearing additional crates marked with the emblem of the United States Army Medical Corps. Reed supervised the unloading personally, ensuring that fortified food supplements and fresh produce were stored properly. The camp commander approached him as the last crate was set down. "You still watching for patterns?" the commander asked in a tone half curious, half respectful. Reed adjusted his gloves and nodded once. "Always," he replied. The commander gave a short, approving nod before moving on. The exchange required no elaboration. Later that week, Reed received a second letter from North Carolina. Ingrid's handwriting appeared as precise as before. She wrote that winter there was colder, that frost gathered on the inside of the barack windows in early morning, yet the women remained strong. She described how some had resumed clerical duties and others assisted in the infirmary under supervision, applying the steadiness they had reclaimed. She ended the letter with another measured line. "We no longer measure our nights." Reed folded the paper carefully and placed it beside the first letter in his drawer. He did not respond immediately. Correspondence regulations required discretion, and he chose his words with the same care he used in medical notes. When he finally drafted a reply, it was brief and factual, expressing confidence in their continued stability and advising attentiveness to diet through winter months. There was no sentiment beyond what professional boundaries allowed. Yet the act of writing reinforced the continuity of responsibility beyond the fence line. As February progressed, a minor outbreak of seasonal illness appeared among a small group of male prisoners housed in a separate compound. Reed moved quickly, isolating symptoms and adjusting schedules before the condition could spread widely. The junior medic remarked on how swiftly the measures were implemented. Reed responded only that timing mattered. The intervention prevented escalation, and within days the situation stabilized. That evening Reed stood alone near the tent entrance, listening to the wind move through pine branches overhead. The sky was clear, scattered with faint stars. He considered how easily oversight might return if vigilance softened. The lesson of the 40 women had not been about dramatic rescue. It had been about the discipline of noticing. In early March the frost receded and warmer air returned, carrying the scent of damp soil and budding grass. Reed conducted routine rounds with renewed energy, observing how winter's toll revealed itself in posture and complexion. He adjusted meal plans slightly, anticipating seasonal shifts before they could influence health. The junior medic, now fully aligned with Reed's method, asked fewer questions and anticipated more steps. One morning, as sunlight filtered through the canvas walls of the tent, Reed paused mid-examination when a prisoner mentioned mild fatigue despite normal vital signs. Instead of dismissing the comment, he scheduled a follow-up check and reviewed the prisoner's work assignments. The adjustment proved minor, yet it reaffirmed his commitment to examine nuance before outcome. Weeks later, in late March, a small envelope arrived bearing no official insignia, only a return address from North Carolina. Inside was a brief note from Ingrid stating that some of the women had been scheduled for repatriation discussions and that they carried their regained strength as proof that they had endured more than confinement. She did not write of gratitude or farewell. She wrote simply, "We learned that being seen changes the body." Reed read the sentence slowly and then placed the letter with the others. He stepped outside and looked at the chalkboard once more. For a moment he considered writing a word upon it, perhaps a reminder for future rotations, but he decided against it. The discipline he had embraced required no inscription. It resided in the way he listened, in the extra minute he allowed silence to reveal detail. As spring approached fully and the yard turned green again, Reed continued his rounds with quiet consistency. Prisoners came and went, records accumulated, seasons shifted. Yet beneath the routine, an unseen recalibration remained constant. Reed understood now that medicine was not only the treatment of evident illness, but the recognition of subtle imbalance before it declared itself. He closed the intake tent one evening as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the compound. The blank chalkboard reflected the amber light, smooth and undisturbed. He brushed a trace of dust from its surface and then stepped away. Somewhere beyond the Georgia border, 40 women walked without counting their breaths or measuring the distance from bunk to doorway. In the stillness of the yard, Reed recognized that the most enduring changes leave no visible mark. They settle quietly into practice, shaping decisions that no one else will record, ensuring that the next faint irregularity will not be overlooked. The wind moved softly through the pine trees as he secured the tent flap and prepared for another morning of names and numbers. He would listen. He would pause. And in that pause, vigilance would remain. Spring settled fully over Camp Briarwood by early April, softening the air and replacing the brittle edge of winter with a warmth that lingered comfortably in the afternoon light. Dr. Thomas Reed noticed the change not by temperature alone, but by posture. Prisoners walked with looser shoulders. Guards removed jackets earlier in the day. The pine trees beyond the fence carried a deeper green, and the ground beneath them no longer held the stiffness of frost. Reed continued his rounds with steady deliberation, clipboard balanced against his palm, pen moving in careful strokes that filled each line without haste. The intake tent remained unchanged in structure, canvas walls breathing faintly with the breeze, instruments arranged in disciplined symmetry. Yet inside, the rhythm of examination had grown quieter, more assured. The junior medic now anticipated adjustments before Reed spoke them aloud, measuring pulse and recording full observations in measured language. The discipline had become shared. One morning a transport truck arrived carrying a small group of new arrivals, among them 2 women transferred from a southern facility. Reed observed as they stepped down, their expressions guarded but composed. He felt the familiar instinct to catalog quickly, to move efficiently through the list, yet he allowed the pause he had cultivated over the past months. He listened before he wrote. The first woman reported no complaints. The second hesitated when asked about sleep. Reed waited without prompting. "Sometimes my heart feels fast," she said quietly. The words echoed faintly with memory. Reed did not react outwardly. He noted the statement in full and scheduled additional monitoring. He reviewed her dietary intake immediately rather than deferring it to routine evaluation. The intervention was small, preventative, and measured. The junior medic glanced at him, as if recognizing the pattern from a previous season. Reed gave no explanation. The lesson required no repetition. That afternoon he stepped outside and stood near the blank chalkboard, its dark surface reflecting the pale blue sky. He traced a faint line with his fingertip where chalk had once rested. The board remained empty, yet in his mind he could still see the number that had changed the course of a week the previous autumn. He did not feel the need to rewrite it. Instead, he returned to the tent and adjusted the meal allocation for the new arrivals, adding fortified milk and fresh greens to their rations from the outset. Prevention, he had come to understand, was quieter than correction but far more enduring. Weeks passed with the steady pace of spring. Dogwood trees bloomed beyond the perimeter fence, their white blossoms visible even from inside the compound yard. Reed walked the grounds occasionally at dusk, listening to the low hum of evening conversation drifting from the barracks. He carried no clipboard during these walks, only observation. The second letter from North Carolina had arrived weeks earlier, and he had since sent a brief reply wishing Ingrid Keller and the others continued health as repatriation discussions progressed. There had been no further correspondence, yet he did not interpret the silence as absence. He interpreted it as stability. One late afternoon, the camp commander approached Reed near the mess hall. "You have changed the tone here," the commander remarked, looking across the yard where prisoners moved in orderly lines without visible strain. Reed regarded the scene before answering. "I adjusted a standard," he said simply. The commander nodded, understanding perhaps more than he articulated. The remark lingered after he departed. Reed reflected on how standards often shift invisibly, not through proclamation, but through repetition of small decisions. He returned to the tent and reviewed the latest charts. The woman who had reported occasional rapid heartbeat showed normal readings across 3 consecutive days. Reed allowed himself a brief exhale, not of relief, but of confirmation that early attention had prevented escalation. As May approached, the air grew warmer and the camp settled into its summer rhythm once more. Reed continued to arrive before sunrise, unlocking the tent while the yard lay quiet. He placed his instruments on the table in precise order and opened the first file of the day. Names rotated. Faces changed. Yet the discipline remained constant. He no longer viewed each intake as a routine obligation. He viewed it as an opportunity to notice what might otherwise be overlooked. One morning, after completing his rounds, Reed remained seated at the desk longer than usual. Sunlight filtered through the canvas wall, casting soft lines across the blank chalkboard outside. He reached for a piece of chalk, held it between his fingers, then set it down again. There was no number to inscribe. The standard had settled beyond symbols. It lived in the quiet space between question and answer, in the extra moment granted before dismissal. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low and the pine trees cast long shadows across the yard, Reed walked to the perimeter fence and paused. The wind carried the scent of cut grass and distant earth. He thought of the letter that had read, "We learned that being seen changes the body." He understood now that being seen also changes the one who sees. He had begun as a physician guided by protocol and efficiency. He had become a physician guided by attention sharpened through experience. The transformation required no ceremony. It required consistency. He turned back toward the tent as the first stars appeared overhead. Tomorrow would bring another list, another set of measured pulses. He would listen for the faint irregularity. He would pause when something felt slightly out of alignment. And in that pause, the discipline that once saved 40 lives would remain active, quiet, and ready, shaping decisions that no one beyond the fence would ever record, yet shaping them all the same. By early June, the air over Camp Briarwood carried the full weight of approaching summer, thick with humidity that softened the edges of sound and slowed movement beneath the midday sun. Dr. Thomas Reed adjusted his routine once more, shifting primary examinations to earlier hours before the heat pressed heavily against canvas walls and wooden steps. The intake tent remained ordered and deliberate, instruments aligned, charts stacked in precise columns. Yet there was a difference in the way Reed now inhabited the space. He no longer entered with the narrow focus of task alone. He entered with awareness that each morning carried the potential for subtle divergence. The blank chalkboard outside reflected the bright light of late spring, its surface clean, untouched since the day he had erased the number that once defined a turning point. New prisoners had rotated through the compound steadily through May, and by June the roster included names from regions Reed had only read about in reports. He approached each intake without assumption, listening for nuance in tone and cadence. One warm morning, a young woman stepped forward during examination and mentioned that she sometimes felt lightheaded when standing after sitting for extended periods. Her chart showed stable vital signs and adequate nutrition. In another season, Reed might have attributed the comment to adjustment. Now he asked additional questions. How long did the sensation last? Did it occur daily? Was it accompanied by shortness of breath? The answers revealed nothing alarming. Yet he scheduled a follow-up evaluation within 48 hours rather than waiting for routine review. The junior medic noted the additional appointment without comment, understanding the pattern of precaution that had become practice. The follow-up revealed mild dehydration exacerbated by heat exposure. The correction was simple: increased water intake, modified work schedule during peak afternoon hours. The symptom resolved within days. Reed regarded the adjustment not as triumph, but as confirmation that attentiveness preserved balance before imbalance declared itself. That evening he walked beyond the tent toward the perimeter fence, where tall grass shifted gently in the humid breeze. The pine trees stood unmoving in the heat, their shadows long and thin across the yard. He paused, recalling the first time he had sensed a pattern forming months earlier. The memory no longer carried urgency. It carried instruction. A clerk from the administration building approached him with updated transfer schedules. Several prisoners were slated for relocation to northern camps as summer advanced. Reed reviewed the list calmly, noting which charts required summary documentation. He took particular care in drafting each report, including dietary notes and observation patterns that might otherwise be considered excessive. He knew now that what seemed minor could accumulate if left unexamined. In late June, another letter arrived from North Carolina. The envelope bore familiar handwriting. Ingrid Keller wrote that repatriation discussions had progressed and that some women had already begun preparations for return home. She described the sensation of stepping onto grass without counting the distance, of waking without measuring breath. Her words remained measured, factual, yet beneath them Reed sensed continuity. She closed with a line that echoed across months. We remember that someone listened. Reed folded the letter slowly and placed it with the others. He did not dwell on sentiment. Instead, he returned to his desk and reviewed the week's charts once more. Listening, he understood, was not a singular act. It was a habit that reshaped environment. By early July, the Georgia heat intensified, reaching into the 90s by midday. Reed adjusted schedules again, instructing guards to rotate work assignments more frequently and to provide additional rest intervals beneath shade. The camp commander approved the measures without hesitation, recognizing the value of prevention that had already proven itself. Reed noticed how resistance to such adjustments had diminished since autumn. Standards, once altered quietly, often remained so without further argument. One afternoon, as thunderclouds gathered in the distance, Reed conducted examinations while rain began to tap softly against the canvas roof. The rhythmic sound filled the tent, steady and even. A prisoner mentioned mild fatigue after extended kitchen duty. Reed listened closely, recalling how small comments once signaled larger imbalance. He adjusted the duty schedule that same day. The fatigue resolved before it deepened into complaint. The rain passed as quickly as it arrived, leaving the yard glistening beneath clearing skies. Reed stepped outside and looked once more at the blank chalkboard. He considered writing a word upon it, perhaps a reminder for future rotations who might inherit the tent. Yet he recognized that symbols fade while practice endures. He left it untouched. In mid-July, nearly a year after the day that had quietly shifted his discipline, Reed sat alone at his desk after completing rounds. The leather case rested open beside him, instruments polished and aligned. He reviewed the initial entry in the oldest chart still stored in his drawer, the first documentation of that long-ago pattern. The numbers no longer carried urgency. They carried memory. He closed the drawer and turned off the lamp. Outside, the yard settled into evening calm. Guards changed posts. Prisoners returned to barracks. The air held the faint scent of approaching rain once more. Reed stepped beyond the tent and walked the perimeter slowly, listening not for irregularity alone, but for continuity. The compound appeared unchanged to distant eyes, yet within its routine lived a discipline shaped by a single decision to pause and look again. Somewhere beyond the fence, 40 women prepared for journeys that would carry them farther still, their strength sustained not by dramatic rescue, but by early recognition. Reed understood that his role in their story would remain unwritten in public records. That did not diminish its weight. As twilight deepened and the first stars appeared above the pine trees, he returned to the tent and secured the flap against the humid air, Tomorrow would bring another intake, another set of measured pulses. He would listen before concluding. He would question before dismissing. And in that deliberate pause between observation and assumption, the standard he had adopted would continue to guide his hands, steady and unannounced, ensuring that no faint irregularity would pass without notice. Late July settled over Camp Briarwood with a steady, unrelenting heat that pressed down from a pale sky and shimmered above the packed red clay of the yard. The air carried the scent of dust and cut grass, and even the pine trees beyond the fence seemed to stand in patient stillness beneath the sun. Dr. Thomas Reed adjusted once more, beginning examinations at first light when the temperature hovered in the low 70s and the breeze still moved with a trace of coolness. The intake tent opened each morning with the same deliberate motion, the canvas flap lifted, the examination table aligned, the leather case placed at the exact corner of the desk. Routine remained intact, yet it no longer defined the limits of his attention. A new rotation of prisoners had arrived during the previous week, and their charts lay stacked neatly in front of him. Reed approached the first file slowly, reading not only the recorded numbers but the spacing between lines, the absence of complaint, the cadence of recorded answers. He had learned that silence sometimes concealed more than words. One woman, transferred from a facility farther south, mentioned difficulty sleeping in the heat. Reed listened to the tone of her voice as carefully as to her pulse. He asked how many hours she rested, whether she woke with shortness of breath, whether her appetite had shifted. The responses revealed no immediate irregularity, yet he noted a faint hesitation when she described standing for long periods during kitchen duty. Rather than dismissing the comment as discomfort from temperature, he adjusted her schedule for the coming week, assigning morning tasks instead of afternoon shifts. The change was minor. It required no formal report. Within days her rest improved and fatigue lessened. Reed recorded the outcome in full sentences, careful not to abbreviate. The junior medic observed the adjustment and followed suit with another prisoner whose posture suggested strain despite normal readings. The practice had become shared language. Outside the tent, the blank chalkboard reflected harsh midday light. Reed occasionally glanced at it during brief pauses, not out of habit, but as a reminder that vigilance did not require display. One afternoon, the camp commander approached while Reed reviewed charts beneath the tent awning. "We have received notice of possible closures later this year," the commander said quietly, referring to gradual consolidation of camps as the post-war landscape shifted. Reed nodded, absorbing the information without surprise. Transitions had become constant. "We will continue as we have," he replied. The commander regarded him for a moment and then agreed. Continuity, Reed understood, did not depend on permanence of location. It depended on discipline carried forward. As August approached, afternoon thunderstorms began to roll across the horizon with predictable rhythm. Dark clouds gathered beyond the pine trees, and rain fell in sudden, steady sheets that cooled the yard briefly before steam rose once more from the ground. Reed conducted examinations while rain tapped softly against canvas overhead, the sound steady and almost meditative. A prisoner mentioned mild dizziness when rising quickly from bed. Reed felt the faint echo of an earlier season, yet did not allow memory to dominate observation. He checked hydration levels, reviewed her diet, and increased her fluid intake for 3 days. The symptom resolved without escalation. The intervention required neither alarm nor recognition. It required only attention applied promptly. In the evenings, Reed sometimes remained seated after rounds, the leather case open beside him, the last light of day filtering through canvas walls. He thought of the letters from North Carolina stored neatly in his drawer. He had not received another since early summer, yet he did not interpret the silence as absence. Stability often produced fewer words. He unfolded the most recent letter one evening and read again the line that had lingered since spring. "We remember that someone listened." He closed his eyes briefly, not in reflection of praise, but in acknowledgement that listening had reshaped him as much as it had preserved others. Outside, the yard quieted as dusk settled, and guards rotated posts beneath soft lantern light. Reed stood and stepped beyond the tent, walking slowly toward the perimeter fence. The grass rustled faintly in the humid breeze. He paused where the pine trees cast long shadows and considered the past year. What had begun as routine had become recalibration. What had once been minor had become meaningful. He understood now that medicine did not exist solely in dramatic moments of intervention. It existed in the space between pulse and assumption, between complaint and conclusion. Late in August, nearly a year after that first subtle pattern had formed, the camp received official notice that operations would gradually wind down over the coming months. Prisoners would be transferred or repatriated, staff reassigned. Reed read the memorandum with measured calm. Change had always been part of the structure. He continued his rounds the following morning without deviation, listening to heartbeats, noting posture, adjusting schedules where needed. The junior medic remarked quietly that the tent would soon stand empty. Reed responded that discipline would travel with them wherever they were sent. The statement was neither dramatic nor sentimental. It was fact. On a warm evening near the end of the month, Reed stepped outside after securing the tent flap. The chalkboard remained blank, smooth against fading light. He touched its surface lightly, feeling the faint texture of slate beneath his fingertips. No numbers, no words. The standard no longer required inscription. It lived in the cadence of his listening, in the patience of his pause. Beyond the fence, cicadas hummed in the trees, their steady rhythm echoing the pulse he had learned to count with renewed care. Somewhere beyond the Georgia border, 40 women moved through days unmeasured by breathlessness, unburdened by the subtle decline that once threatened them. Reed did not claim ownership of that outcome. He recognized it as consequence of attention applied when it mattered. As darkness settled fully and the first stars appeared above the pine canopy, he turned back toward the tent and extinguished the lamp inside. Tomorrow would bring another intake, another set of names and numbers, perhaps in a different camp, perhaps under a different sky. The location might change. The routine might shift. Yet the discipline would remain. He would listen before concluding. He would question before dismissing. And in that quiet interval between observation and assumption, vigilance would continue, steady and unannounced, shaping outcomes long before they required rescue. September returned with a quieter heat than the year before, less oppressive yet persistent enough to remind those inside Camp Briarwood that summer had not fully released its hold. Official memorandums circulated more frequently now, typed on thin government paper and pinned briefly to the administration board before being filed away. Consolidation plans advanced. Transfers accelerated. The compound felt both active and temporary, as though it existed in the final stretch of a long breath. Dr. Thomas Reed continued to unlock the intake tent before sunrise, the metal latch cool beneath his fingers in the early light. The canvas walls still carried faint stains from past storms, and the wooden examination table bore the same subtle scratches from years of use. Yet even as the camp prepared for eventual closure, Reed's routine did not waver. He aligned his instruments with the same precision, placed charts in careful stacks, and allowed the familiar pause before each examination to anchor his attention. A new intake arrived one morning under a sky streaked with thin clouds. The prisoners stepped down from the transport truck in orderly fashion, their faces marked more by fatigue from travel than by visible illness. Reed observed from a measured distance before beginning his assessments. He asked about sleep, appetite, breath, posture. His questions were unhurried. The junior medic mirrored his cadence, recording answers in complete sentences without abbreviation. The discipline had become habit rather than effort. One woman mentioned that the journey north had left her feeling faint during prolonged standing. Reed did not attribute the sensation solely to travel. He requested additional hydration, scheduled a follow-up evaluation within 48 hours, and adjusted her initial work assignment to lighter duty. The intervention required no announcement. Within days her energy stabilized. The pattern remained consistent. Small correction, steady outcome. In the afternoons, Reed reviewed charts beneath the tent awning, while cicadas hummed faintly beyond the pine trees. The blank chalkboard stood beside the entrance, its surface untouched, a quiet witness to seasons that had passed. Occasionally a guard leaned against it while waiting for orders, unaware of the weight it once carried. Reed did not correct the gesture. The significance of the board resided within him now, not upon its surface. As September progressed, the first signs of autumn reappeared in the subtle coolness of early mornings. Reed walked the perimeter fence at dusk, observing the yard as prisoners completed light duties and returned to their barracks. He noted posture and pace without writing anything down. Observation had become instinctive, embedded in the way he moved through space. One evening the camp commander joined him near the edge of the compound. "You will likely be reassigned before winter," the commander said, voice calm. Reed acknowledged the statement with a slight nod. Reassignment no longer felt disruptive. The discipline he had cultivated would travel with him. "Wherever you go," the commander added, "keep doing it this way." Reed did not respond with agreement or modesty. He simply inclined his head once more. The following week a final letter arrived from North Carolina. The envelope bore familiar handwriting, though the return address had changed slightly. Ingrid Keller wrote that repatriation had been confirmed and that she would soon return home. She described the sensation of boarding a train without calculating the distance between breaths. She mentioned that several of the women planned to resume work in hospitals or offices, carrying with them the steadiness they had regained. Her closing line was brief. "Standards remain even when walls change." Reed folded the letter carefully and placed it with the others. He did not reply immediately. Some acknowledgments required silence rather than response. That evening he remained seated at his desk long after rounds were complete. The leather case lay open beside him, instruments polished and aligned. Outside, the yard settled into twilight, lantern light casting soft circles across packed earth. Reed removed the earliest chart from his drawer, the one that recorded faint irregularities long ago. He traced the numbers lightly with his finger. They no longer stirred urgency. They stirred clarity. The transformation had not been dramatic. It had been deliberate. He closed the drawer and stepped outside once more. The chalkboard reflected the fading light, smooth and unmarked. He considered writing a word, perhaps vigilance or attention, yet he recognized that inscription was unnecessary. The discipline he carried no longer required display. In early October, formal orders arrived confirming his reassignment to a medical facility in the Midwest. Preparations began quietly. Files were organized, supplies inventoried. The junior medic, now fully confident in the cadence of observation, would remain through the final months of camp operation. On Reed's last morning at Briarwood, he arrived before sunrise as usual. The air held a faint chill, signaling the approach of colder days. He unlocked the tent and arranged his instruments one final time. He conducted rounds with steady composure, listening carefully, adjusting minor details where necessary. No dramatic events marked the day, only routine, carried out with intention. After the final examination, he closed the leather case and stepped outside. The blank chalkboard stood beside the entrance, pale in the early light. He placed his hand briefly against its surface, feeling the cool slate beneath his palm. Then he stepped away without adding a mark. The standard did not reside in chalk. It resided in the pause before conclusion, in the extra question asked when silence lingered too long. As the transport truck prepared to carry him north, Reed looked once more across the yard where pine trees cast long morning shadows. The compound appeared unchanged, yet within it a recalibration had taken root that would continue long after his departure. He boarded the truck without ceremony. The engine rumbled to life, and the gates opened slowly. As Camp Briarwood receded behind him, Reed did not think of rescue or heroism. He thought of listening. He thought of the space between pulse and assumption. And as the road carried him toward a different facility beneath a different sky, he carried with him the quiet discipline that had once preserved 40 lives and would, in time, preserve others still. The train carried Dr. Thomas Reed north through long stretches of farmland and quiet towns where autumn had already taken firm hold. Fields turned pale gold beneath wide Midwestern skies, and trees lined with rust and amber. He watched the landscape from his seat without urgency, medical case resting upright against his polished shoes, orders folded neatly inside his coat pocket. The reassignment placed him at a military medical facility outside St. Louis, a brick complex larger than Camp Briarwood and structured with greater formality. The building stood in orderly rows, windows reflecting cold October light, corridors echoing with footsteps that carried authority rather than improvisation. On his first morning there, Reed arrived before sunrise as he always had, the air sharp enough to sting his lungs. He unlocked his assigned examination room and paused briefly at the doorway, allowing silence to settle before he stepped inside. The room was sterile, well lit, stocked with updated equipment, and clean white walls instead of canvas. Yet the essential elements remained unchanged: a desk, a chair, a table where a patient would sit and wait to be examined. Reed placed his leather case on the counter and arranged his instruments with deliberate precision. He reviewed the roster for the day, a mix of returning servicemen and transferred detainees awaiting repatriation processing. The structure here was more rigid, the pace brisk. Efficiency was expected, even praised. Reed understood efficiency. He had once relied on it almost exclusively. The first patient entered, a young soldier reporting fatigue after long travel. Reed listened to his pulse, measured blood pressure, asked about sleep patterns. The answers were unremarkable. Yet Reed allowed the familiar pause before closing the chart. He asked one more question about appetite. The soldier hesitated and admitted he had skipped meals during transit. Reed adjusted the evaluation accordingly, recommending dietary supplementation and rest before discharge clearance. The correction was minor. It required no report beyond routine notation. Yet it affirmed the discipline he carried. Later that week, a small group of female detainees arrived from a southern transfer facility, awaiting temporary processing before repatriation. As they stepped into the examination room one by one, Reed observed posture, tone, cadence. One woman mentioned lightheadedness when rising too quickly from a seated position. The chart listed her as stable. Reed did not rely solely on that entry. He scheduled additional hydration and follow-up checks within 48 hours. The supervising officer raised an eyebrow at the added notation. Reed responded evenly that prevention reduced complication. The officer nodded, accepting the explanation without further inquiry. The pattern repeated over the following weeks. Small adjustments made early prevented larger disruptions later. The medical staff around Reed began to notice the steadiness of his evaluations. He did not rush to conclude. He did not dramatize findings. He listened, paused, asked one more question when silence lingered. The discipline shaped the environment gradually. Younger physicians adopted similar habits, recording fuller notes, allowing space between observation and conclusion. In November, the first frost coated the grounds outside the facility, leaving a thin white layer across grass at dawn. Reed walked from his quarters to the medical building with measured steps, breath visible in the cold air. He carried no chalkboard here, no canvas tent. Yet the blank walls of his examination room reflected the same internal standard. One evening, after completing rounds, he removed the letters from North Carolina from his coat pocket. He had carried them since departure, not displayed but preserved. He unfolded the last one and read again the line that had remained with him. Standards remain even when walls change. He folded the paper carefully and placed it in his desk drawer at the new facility. The drawer closed softly, the sound precise and contained. December arrived with colder winds and early darkness. Reed continued his rounds with unwavering rhythm. One afternoon, a detainee reported subtle chest discomfort that might have been dismissed as anxiety from pending travel. Reed listened longer, measured carefully, and ordered a precautionary evaluation that revealed a mild nutritional deficiency compounded by stress. Early intervention corrected the imbalance before it deepened. The supervising physician later remarked that the additional evaluation had likely prevented future complication. Reed acknowledged the statement with a quiet nod. He did not recount earlier experiences. The lesson required no explanation. By late December, the facility prepared for holiday leave rotations. Decorations appeared modestly in administrative offices, small evergreen wreaths placed near doorways. Reed maintained his schedule, arriving before sunrise, reviewing charts beneath steady fluorescent light. On Christmas morning, he conducted rounds as usual, pausing briefly outside the building afterward. Snow had fallen lightly overnight, covering the grounds in a thin, even layer that reflected pale winter sun. He watched staff and patients move across the courtyard, footsteps leaving temporary impressions that would fade by afternoon. The scene carried no drama. It carried continuity. Somewhere across an ocean, repatriated women stepped onto home soil, carrying regained strength into lives reshaped by conflict. Reed did not imagine their paths beyond what had been written. He understood that his role had been a brief intersection, yet the discipline born from that intersection had extended far beyond it. As the year closed, Reed sat at his desk one final evening before the holiday break. He reviewed a stack of completed charts, each one marked by thorough notation and measured care. He closed the final file and turned off the desk lamp. Outside, the winter air remained still, snow glinting faintly beneath distant streetlights. Reed stepped into the cold and allowed himself a single steady breath. The environment had changed. The walls were brick instead of canvas. The sky held northern frost rather than southern humidity. Yet the standard remained intact. He would continue to listen before concluding, to question before dismissing, to pause when subtle irregularity appeared. In that pause, unseen and unrecorded by history, lives would bend quietly away from decline. And though no chalkboard carried a number to remind him, he did not need one. The discipline had become part of the hand that reached for the stethoscope, part of the ear that leaned closer, part of the voice that asked one more careful question before closing the file. January deepened across the Midwest with a steady cold that settled into brick walls and lingered along hospital corridors before dawn. Dr. Thomas Reed arrived each morning before the first shift bell, his footsteps echoing lightly against tile floors polished to a muted sheen. Snow remained piled in quiet ridges along the courtyard outside the medical facility, footprints crossing and recrossing until midday sun softened their edges. Inside, the examination rooms held the clean scent of antiseptic and paper. Reed placed his leather case on the counter, aligned his instruments with measured care, and reviewed the day's roster without haste. Months had passed since his reassignment from the southern camp, yet the discipline he carried remained unchanged. It had settled into him so completely that he no longer thought of it as adjustment. It was simply the way he practiced. The morning list included returning servicemen preparing for discharge, detainees awaiting transport, and civilian workers requiring routine evaluation. Each entered with a different posture, a different cadence of speech. Reed listened carefully to each heartbeat, allowed the quiet pause before recording his conclusion, and asked the additional question when something felt faintly misaligned. One winter afternoon, a young orderly lingered after assisting with examinations. "How do you know when to look deeper?" the orderly asked, not with challenge but curiosity. Reed considered the question for a moment, his gaze steady. "When something is almost normal," he replied. "Almost requires attention." The orderly nodded slowly, absorbing the simplicity of the answer. It was not dramatic instruction. It was principle distilled. In February, a small group of former detainees passed through the facility en route to ports of departure. Among the paperwork accompanying them was a brief notation from a northern camp physician referencing earlier dietary adjustments that had prevented complication during transit. Reed recognized the language of precaution in the phrasing. He did not know whether those adjustments traced directly to the women he once examined, yet he sensed continuity in the method. Early correction had become standard in more than one location. One evening, after completing rounds, Reed opened the drawer of his desk and unfolded the letters he had preserved. The paper had grown slightly worn along the folds, the ink steady and precise. He read them again without nostalgia, focusing instead on the clarity within their lines. "We walk without counting our steps. We learn that being seen changes the body. Standards remain even when walls change." The phrases did not feel sentimental. They felt instructional. He folded the letters carefully and returned them to the drawer. Outside, snow began to fall again, light and consistent, covering the courtyard in a quiet white layer. Reed stepped to the window and watched as flakes descended without urgency. The world beyond the glass appeared softer, outlines blurred yet steady. He thought not of rescue, but of recalibration. The shift that had begun in a canvas tent beneath a humid Georgia sky had followed him across state lines, through seasons, into brick corridors and fluorescent light. It had altered not only his own method but the tone of those who worked beside him. By early March, the facility prepared for a new influx of patients as post-war processing accelerated. Reed trained 2 incoming physicians assigned to his department, demonstrating not only procedure but cadence. He encouraged them to read charts fully rather than scanning for anomalies alone. He asked them to listen beyond the first answer given. "Silence often holds the second answer," he told them during a quiet moment between appointments. They nodded, perhaps uncertain, yet attentive. Over the following weeks, Reed observed their practice subtly shifting. They paused before closing files. They scheduled follow-ups for minor complaints that once might have been dismissed. The discipline multiplied without proclamation. Spring approached again, nearly a year since the day that had quietly redirected 40 lives. The snow melted from the courtyard, revealing damp earth beneath. Reed walked outside one evening as daylight lingered longer in the sky. He stood beneath bare branches that would soon bud and considered the arc of the past year. No headline had marked it. No ceremony had commemorated it. Yet the recalibration endured. Somewhere across an ocean, women who once stood in a line beneath yellow bulbs now stepped into mornings without measuring breath or counting heartbeats before sleep. Reed did not imagine their faces clearly. He remembered instead the posture of steadiness, the calm with which one voice had spoken when something felt wrong. He carried that memory not as attachment, but as standard. Back inside the facility, a bell signaled the end of the evening shift. Reed returned to his office, closed the drawer containing the letters, and extinguished the desk lamp. He walked down the corridor slowly, listening to the faint hum of lights and distant footsteps. The discipline he carried required no recognition. It required only continuation. As he stepped outside into the cooling air of early spring, the sky held the first hint of warmth to come. Reed paused briefly before heading toward his quarters. The path ahead remained unremarkable, lit by simple lamplight. He understood that the most enduring changes often pass unnoticed by those who benefit from them. They do not announce themselves. They do not demand applause. They settle quietly into practice, shaping decisions long before they require correction. And in that quiet space between observation and assumption, where almost normal invites deeper listening, lives shift course without spectacle. Reed adjusted his coat against the evening chill and continued walking, steady and unhurried, carrying with him the standard he would not lower, the pause he would not abandon, and the certainty that vigilance, once chosen, becomes part of who you are.